got a little ahead of myself. So I'm going to show a tutorial on how you can use a linear light layer to help really finalize your image, give it a little bit more depth, a little bit more pop, and separate the background from the foreground, which can be very helpful if you find yourself in the issue of my character just doesn't stand out like I want them to. This can be really helpful. This is a trick that I picked up from Trent. I don't know how to say his last name, Kuniyaga. He's an very what I consider to be successful and accomplished artist, and he puts a lot of tutorials out. He works in the gaming industry a lot. He's worked for a lot of big gaming studios and really, really, really knows his stuff and really helps. So this is a trick that I picked up from him, and it's something I haven't looked back on. So let's go. So I'm using Clip Studio. I'm sure every app has something similar to the linear light layer. I know Procreate does. I'm sure Photoshop does. If you don't know about layers, I'll kind of do like a brief explanation of them, or like the layer blending modes. It's a lot to try to put in this tutorial, so they can be later on down the line. But with your layer blending modes, they all, of course, are going to serve as a separate purpose. So what I really like about the linear light mode is it adds to your painting while still preserving everything you've done underneath. So if you've rendered out your subject, if you added shadows, if you've added lighting, if you've done all of that, and you still want to keep all of that information without coloring over it, linear light is a great mode to do that with. So for example, if you're just working in the normal mode, anything that you put on here, it's going to color over top of it. So if you're adding green, this green is now serving to completely erase what you've done, right? It's going to cover that. As you play in the different modes, you'll notice that each mode makes this green do something different. Multiply is going to make this color darker. This is a very popular mode to use for shading and shadows because it immediately takes whatever color you're doing and puts it darker, and it sits on top of that layer. You're still getting a lot of information in here, but it's not going to be great for lighting because once again it's going to make that color darker, but is great for shading. Personally, the layer that I like to use for shading, because Multiply can sometimes work like the normal blending mode and it still covers over on top of what I've already done, I like to use the hard light layer mode. It's going to be hard to see here because hard light doesn't make a color darker. So you do need to go into your color picking with a darker color in mind. So in this case, I'm going to switch this out to a dark purple. And you can see that it covers the image, but you still see everything underneath. You can still see the lighting, the shadows, you can still see the highlights. All of the information that's in this piece now is still here in the highlight. If I were to go over to Multiply, it's really dark. You can't really see as much, and this is an 100% opacity, so it doesn't really, it's still not going to preserve a lot of information. But once again, great for shadows, but personally, I like the hard layer mode. The linear light layer mode works similar to the hard light layer mode, where it still preserves a lot of your information, but it adds a pop of color. And what I like about this mode is it can make it seem like a really natural light, and if done correctly, it can be so subtle that you can't even figure out where this light is coming from. It just feels like another part of the piece or colors that you're putting into the piece. So what I personally like to do, I'm going to go ahead and delete this, but what I like to do for thought processing when it comes to picking out this color or what color you want to use for your last pop of color is I like to play on whatever colors I've chosen, colors I haven't chosen, colors that make sense, and colors that will go against the grain. So for this painting, we're seeing a lot of yellows, beiges. There's some purple here in this tie, but there's a color that is very, very, very subtle, and it won't even pick up by Clip Studio just because I pulled this image off of Google and it's not very clear. But in his eyebrow here, in his nose, in his mouth, and in his neck, I can see little pops of green. That green is so subtle and it's not found in anywhere else in the painting that it would be a really great pop in addition to add. The reason why I don't want to do this purple is because it's really dark, and for lighting purposes would it make a lot of sense. My purpose here is to help try to separate the background from the foreground. So I want a light that's going to separate the two, draw the attention to the subject, and still make sense with the rest of the color palette. So I personally think that green would be a great choice here, but you can use whatever color you want and you can play around. So I'm gonna just go off and I'm gonna use my gut instinct and I'm gonna go with the green. I usually like to reduce the opacity to about 30%. Most of the time I'm working at 50%, but even 50% lighting can be very intense. So what I like to do is I like to grab a big soft brush. So I'm using my soft airbrush. You don't want a lot of hard lines with your lighting. You want this to be natural. You want it to be concise. Depending upon how you have your layer set up, because I put this from Google, of course, there's no layer information. How I usually do it is I usually put my subject that's on one layer, my background's on another layer, so I can just clip my linear light layer to my subject and it won't touch the background at all. That's a whole nother tutorial for a whole nother different day, but if you're picking up what I'm putting down, that's usually how that works. So for this one, because it's all just on one image and there's no separation, this is the big soft brush is going to be crucial because it's not going to give you a lot of those harsh lines and you're going to have to erase away those lines around the perimeter of your subject. So just go into that. This is what it looks like at 50%. And why I say it's still kind of just so much, it's such a harsh light. I like to go around about 30. Once again, this is completely up to you. It's something that you can just play around with until it gets the mood you want. But personally, this is where I like to go. And you just need to grab your soft brush. You need to go pretty bigger than your subject because, once again, you don't want harsh lines. You really want this to just kind of appear. Very natural, very subtle. So I just like to go around the perimeter. This is where I'm going to say these light source is coming from. I'm going to say that it's coming from this way. This is where I want this pop of light to come from. Now you can also use linear light to give you two different color lights, which I personally like to do as it just adds a little bit more depth. And you can have another light coming here, but you want this one to be a different color. So what I'm going to do here is now I'm going to use some of this yellow that's found, but in a not so intense way, I'm going to add it to the back part. So I'm going to use yellow. I've already selected this yellow here from earlier, and I'm just going to add a little bit of yellow to the back. You don't need as much as the green because this is just the foreground light. Its main purpose is just to add a little bit more color definition to the piece. But this is our main light. This is the real pop of color. This is the secondary color. After you have all your colors and they look all good, then you can just go in and erase it. Personally, I'm just going to use the soft airbrush again. Once again, I'm using Clip Studio. Everyone else is different. And then I'm just going to use my no color option here, this opacity one. And you just erase around the edges until you kind of get what you're looking for. And the reason why I like to go soft is because if you're doing it like this, you're more than likely going to start to erase the light that's coming on your character. And you don't want to get too much of that off and you don't want it to be too obvious. So if I were to use just a hard brush, it's so obvious. It's so obvious where it's stopping and where it's ending. And it just doesn't have as much of a nice flow as the green. So you're just going to keep erasing until you erase the perimeters around your subject line. And once you have it to where you like it, then you can start cleaning up the inside as well. When I get to the character, I don't like to erase as much as I like to blend. So I have actually a blending brush that I like to use here that really, I'm not sure if it's a smudger, but it just really kind of softens those edges for me. And it works really well at kind of just blending everything out. And from here, really it is just playing around with it. But once you kind of have it to where you like, and you kind of have it set to where you like with the opacity, it adds just the smallest pop of color. And I'm actually would even consider taking that down just a little bit more. So this is without it. Completely unnecessary. You don't need the light. This painting is obviously clearly finished, but just a little bit of color can really help that. Now your eye is immediately drawn to this guy, and the colors can really help tell a story for him. It just, it's such a fun, neat thing to do, and it does play a lot on, where your eye is going, what your eye is seeing. It gives it this really nice polished look that I think more people should utilize. It's really fun. It's a great way to add color in there. What's also nice is that sometimes during my color painting process, I'm thinking so much about, oh, I want this color here, I want this color there, I want that color there, but you can't fit it into the piece because it doesn't make sense. The linear light layer does a really good job of letting you add these colors in that you may have not otherwise used, but it just helps in my opinion. So this is my little tutorial. It's my first one. I hope I explained it kind of okay. Most of it's just probably gibberish. I made this really for a friend because they asked me to give them an example, and I couldn't think of a better example than a tutorial. So I probably will make more short tutorials in the future. I'm, of course, by no means an expert, but I'm willing to share the things I picked up along the way. So see you later.